Hey, my name is Jeffrey. I'm not the type of person who likes hotels or usually stays in them, but I always did in case I needed to. I don't know. The idea of laying down in a bed where a lot of other people lie down was pretty weird to me. I was with this prejudice for a long time, but after spending one night in this hotel, let's just say that instead of being more scared, I learned to appreciate the other hotels. This is because in no hotel I have ever stayed in, I experienced something like what I experienced in the Hotel Alhamra, a place so sinister and scary that I'm sure no one would go there unless by accident. I remember perfectly well when I stumbled upon that hotel. I was tired, my body heavy after hours of driving in the pouring rain. The flashlights and the flashing neon sign announcing Hotel Alhambra were like a beacon in the darkness. I didn't have much choice, and to be honest, I didn't feel much like looking either. So without much thought, I turned the wheel into the parking lot and drove in. The building was an old brick building. The kind that has a sort of charm, but you know it's falling apart. It wasn't fancy or modern, but it had that air of mystery that only old hotels can have. I was never afraid of the paranormal. I even found it exciting. Upon entering, I was greeted by an older man with a tired look on his face and an exaggeratedly forced smile. The reception was decorated with antique furniture and worn tapestries. "Good evening. Do you have any rooms available?" The man nodded and started doing paperwork. In the meantime, I took the opportunity to look around. There was something strange in the atmosphere, a kind of heaviness in the air. But I thought it was probably due to my own tiredness and the gloomy atmosphere of the place. While I was doing the paperwork, the man kept looking at me. Something about him made me feel very uncomfortable, and this time it wasn't my perception. The man was staring at me, frozen. I could even see him writing in his book and listing me as a tenant without even looking at what he was writing. He could only look at me. Once he finished, the man stood up and I was terrified. The man was almost 6 feet tall. Yes, he just looked like an old man, but a very imposing old man. As he looked for the keys, he would turn and stare at me at times, as if trying to make sure I didn't leave. Finally, the man handed me the key to the room and gave me directions. As I was leaving, I could see out of the corner of my eye that he was still staring at me. Finally, as if knowing that I was watching him too, he gave me a small half smile and sat back down. After that curious encounter, I went upstairs with my suitcase in hand and found the room without any problems. As I opened the door, a blast of cold air hit me in the face. It was as if the room was freezing, even though the weather outside was not so extreme. I set my suitcase on the floor and walked into the room. The decor was stark with antique furniture and a large bed in the center. Nothing out of the ordinary, I thought to myself, but I would soon discover that I was very wrong. The first sign that something wasn't right was the sound. A soft wind seemed to come from everywhere in the room, but it sounded just weird. The wind had like a sound as if it was a voice. I ignored it at first, thinking maybe it was the creaking of the old hotel structure, but the rustling intensified, becoming a constant murmur that echoed in my ears. I tried to shake off the uncomfortable feeling and decided to take a hot shower to relax. Luckily, the hot water was working. I started to relax when suddenly the terror intensified. I heard the bathroom door slowly open. At that moment, I thought it was the wind, but the opening of the door was accompanied by something. When I looked in the direction of the door, I could see a shadow through the curtain. Someone was walking very slowly towards me. I could hear him mumbling something. He was telling me something. If it was a thief, I had a small advantage. He was sure to think I hadn't seen him. I grabbed the marble soap dish and was ready to smash it over his head. I quickly opened the curtain when the shadow was closer than ever. I was ready for a fight. But nothing. There was no one behind the curtain. No one could have hidden because it was literally in front of me. If there was someone, they just vanished. I tried to fool myself that it was probably a shadow caused by the position of the curtain. that I was probably seeing things because I was tired, but inside, I knew something was wrong. Something was going on here that had no explanation, and I could no longer deny it. Either that, or I was going crazy. From then on, everything went from bad to worse. As I was drying my hair in front of the mirror, I saw a fleeting movement behind me. I turned sharply, but there was no one else in the room. My heart began to pound as I searched for a logical explanation for what I saw, but I knew I wasn't going to find one. This was more than enough for me. I had to leave the hotel as soon as possible. I went to get dressed, and as if knowing I was leaving, the room became more oppressive than ever. The murmurs that I had mistaken for the wind before were much more aggressive, to the point where they sounded like people talking to me nonstop. The room was much colder, almost freezing. I thought it might be because I was just coming out of the bath, but who was I kidding? There was no point in denying what was happening. As I was about to finish grabbing my things, I heard a much louder noise coming from the foot of the bed. I looked quickly toward the source of the sound, and there it was. There was a person. A person was sitting at the foot of the bed. I stared at it, not knowing what to say or do, and it was in that inspection that I realized that it might look like a person, but it was not. His eyes were red, his skin was gray, and his face was full of holes and bumps all over. As I looked at him, I noticed that his mouth was moving, as if whispering something I couldn't understand. Once we crossed our gazes, his eyes were fixed on me, and furious he shouted at me, "Get out!" Terrified, I grabbed my suitcase and ran out of the room before I had finished putting everything away. Before I left, I heard him stand up and run with me. When I was only a few inches from the door, I felt an intense pain in my back, but that didn't stop me from running. I ran down the stairs 2 at a time, with the feeling that at any moment, this being was going to jump at me from the shadows. Arriving at the reception desk, I left the key on the counter and headed for the exit. The old man was there, with the same forced smile on his face. "Are you leaving now, sir?" Ghost. There's a ghost in the room. You must get out of here." "Oh, thank you very much for letting us know. I'll be sure to send someone to control the situation." I nodded my head, unable to articulate any words. I just wanted to get out of there as fast as possible and forget the whole experience. As I did so, I could see the receptionist still staring at me. He had his hand up, and he was waving at me. When I finally stepped outside, I took a deep breath of fresh night air. I looked back one last time, seeing the flickering lights of the Alhamra Hotel glowing in the darkness. As I settled into another hotel, I took off my shirt and saw my back in the mirror. I had a mark on my back as if someone had scratched me. The weird thing was that my shirt was intact. Temptation got the better of me, and I Googled the hotel several times to see if anything else had happened there. And sure enough, it had. Dozens of videos in that hotel with people haunted by ghosts, furniture moving by itself, and even kids who wanted to go in just to see ghosts. Do you know what the weirdest thing was? No matter when the video was taken, what time of day it was filmed, or what part of the hotel it was in, there was always the manager. He always had that forced, awkward smile looking at the camera, as if he knew the person on the other side of the video. As if he knew it was me watching it.
It's room 209. Amy says nobody's checked into that room, and there's reports of screaming coming from that room. Amy, he's on his way down there right now. What's going on, John? There's no one checked into that room. There should be nobody in there.
Hey, my name is Edward Jones. I don't know if you know me, but I'm a well-known Olympic swimmer. I've dedicated my whole life to swimming, and luckily, I've always been a lucky person. I've always been a person that things work out for me. Until one day. One day I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and I saw something beyond my understanding. Something that no one should ever see. I was coming back from a swimming competition, and as usual, I I didn't have many options for accommodation until I saw a hotel. The place looked promising from the outside. It had a rather rustic style for a hotel. It reminded me a lot of the house where I lived when I was a kid, although I admit I don't have the best memories of it. From the moment I walked through the front door, something seemed wrong. The atmosphere was tense, as if the air was charged with static electricity. When the receptionist served me, at first, I couldn't help but think she was quite friendly. But then I started to get quite uncomfortable. She talked to me like she cared about me, which seemed like a good thing, but she turned it to something pretty creepy. And to make it worse, she seemed reluctant to give me my room keys. I took the elevator up to the 3rd floor, where my room was located. As I walked down the dark hallway, I heard whispers that seemed to be coming from the walls. I shook my head, thinking it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I went on, the whispers became more audible, more incessant. Finally, I reached my room and entered, expecting to find some peace. But instead, I was met with an even more oppressive feeling. The air was heavy. I tried to shake off the feeling and settled into bed, trying to relax. But then the noises started. Knocking on the walls, whispering in my ear, footsteps coming and going with no discernible pattern. It was as if people were walking all over the house, coming and going with no discernible direction. But you know what the worst part was? The worst part was what this place generated in me internally. It was a feeling that this was all very familiar, but this was the first time I had ever come to this hotel in my life. Anyway, whenever I feel that something is familiar, it is usually good. But this was horrible. I felt like I was suffocating. I couldn't breathe and the air was getting heavier and heavier. I tried to call the front desk to complain about the noises and the air. Maybe it was all in my imagination and the footsteps were from another floor and the feeling of heat was a problem in the ventilation. But to my surprise, the phone didn't work either. I threw myself frustrated on the bed, trying to decide whether to go downstairs to complain. Honestly, in another situation, I would have, but the manager gave me such a bad feeling that I wanted to interact with her as little as possible. Set it off the worst moment in the hotel, the electricity supply in the hotel went out, leaving me in total darkness. If I had been a little freaked out by the noises before, imagine how I felt without light. I decided I had to get out of that room as soon as possible. Go outside and get some air, or even go to another hotel if the problem is not going to be repaired. I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, only to find an even more terrifying scene. The lights flickered intermittently, revealing a figure moving in the shadows. It was not a human figure, although in the first few seconds I thought it was. It was dark and fast, and it was moving quickly towards me. I barely had time to reason what was happening, and before I could do anything about it, the shadow was right next to me. I thought about running, but before I could make the slightest movement, I felt a strange sensation in my body. The air. I was short of breath. As I looked at my neck, the shadow had reached out to my neck. It was choking me. But how was that possible? It didn't even have a physical form. I tried to run and get as far away as possible, but the farther I went, the worse my shortness of breath became. Meanwhile, the shadow kept staring at me, materializing horrendous fire-red eyes that were staring at my movements. I ran down the hallway trying to find a way out, but every door I tried was blocked or led to an empty room. I felt like a mouse trapped in a maze, and the air was getting thinner and thinner to the point where I started to see white. I felt like I was going to pass out at any moment. I wasn't going to last much longer. I went back to my room and suddenly, as if nothing had happened, I started breathing normally again. I didn't know who or what this being was that was harassing me, but he didn't want me out of the room. Normally, I would have stayed until everything passed. Sooner or later, the light would return and I could leave. Of that, I had no doubt. The only problem was that in those few seconds that I left, the room had changed. In the complete darkness, it was much more oppressive and frightening than before. The footsteps I heard before materialized. I could see almost nothing, but I could make out shadows walking back and forth across the room. Some of them were walking, but others were standing still, watching me as if waiting for me to enter. I could notice how those shadows were slowly moving toward where I was, and I didn't want to be close by the time they reached me. Terrified, but with the need to escape, I left the room again and ran as fast as I could down the hallway. I could see out of the corner of my eye as the shadows began to materialize, and at the same time, I began to run out of air again. I finally reached the end of the hallway and found an emergency staircase. Without a second thought, I ran down, hoping to find an exit to the outside. But instead, I found myself in a dark, dank basement full of narrow corridors and padlocked doors. As I wandered through the subway labyrinth, I heard a whisper in my ear, so close I could almost feel the breath on my skin. I turned around, but there was no one there, only darkness and the sound of my own heart beating in my ears. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I found a door ajar at the end of a hallway. I pushed it with all my might and stepped out into the open air, gasping and trembling with terror. I looked back and saw the hotel building dark and silent in the night. I ran away from that cursed place, promising myself that I would never set foot there again. But as I ran away, I ran down the street looking at the hotel without realizing that ahead of me, a white light was coming closer and closer. The only thing I remember about it was the sound of the car brake and the hotel manager running towards me, worried. I need you to be as direct as possible. What is my brother's condition? I'll tell you the truth, Miss Jones. Little Ed's condition is quite complex. Since the traffic accident, he's still trapped in his mind. He's convinced he's an adult. He's convinced he's coming back from swimming competitions and he's always trying to escape from places. Yes, sometimes it's a hotel, sometimes a house. He even told us he was in a prison. The place changes, but the story is always the same. Someone forbidding him to escape, hanging him and locking him in an enclosed space. That damn... How is the police process going? Slow, but there's a lot of evidence and witnesses. The marks on Ed's neck should be enough to put him away. To think that a father would do this to his son. Once Ed's out, I understand you'll be looking after him, right? Yes, but I don't know what will happen. He had some resentment towards me. I didn't want him to be in that house, and our father turned him against me. We were still seeing each other, but he was very uncomfortable around me. The adjustment process will be a little difficult, but I assure you, he will be much better. Do you want to go see him? Of course. Oh, Ed, you were going to be a great swimmer. My name is Jake Andrews, and I've been running for too long. It's been 3 years since that night in college, and it's my story. Back in college, I was a member of my school's debate team. Now at the time, our debate team was among the top 10 in the country, and as such, we regularly traveled cross-state to represent and compete against other schools. One particular trip in my third year of college, our group was expected to travel to Illinois, Chicago, to participate in one of the largest debate competitions of the year. Due to some complications, however, we couldn't head out as early as we hoped, and it ended up getting dark while on the road. Instead of driving late at night, our supervisor decided that it would be best to check into a hotel and keep moving first thing in the morning. We ended up in a small town near Chicago, and after driving for a while, we finally found a hotel that stood alone, away from the rest of the buildings. Just by looking at it, I could tell there was something wrong with that place. But I was tired, and there weren't many other options that night. Its exterior was old, and the building gave off this eerie vibe. We were greeted at the door by one Mr. Anderson, who said he was the hotel manager. Stood about 5'5", had bright blue eyes, yellow teeth, and a large nose along with a smile plastered on his face. After a while, he showed us to our rooms, pairing us two to a room and leaving us to get comfortable. The rooms of the hotel were just as eerie as its exterior. The wallpaper was peeling, the floors creaked, and the lights were constantly flickering. I was paired with my best friend Jesse, and not long after, Nico, one of the members of our group, knocked on our door to tell us Mr. Anderson had invited us all down for dinner. I was sleepy at the time, but the thought of a good meal and bed was tempting, so I decided to go down. It was only as I was heading downstairs that I realized it seemed our group was the only people in the hotel. I got downstairs to the sight of all 11 of my mates seated at a long table with lots of food. I noticed our supervisor and driver weren't at the table, but I figured they were just tired and quickly sat to eat. We all talked and laughed as we ate, and for a while, the eerie and silent hotel didn't feel in any way creepy. Eventually, I moved a bowl of food closer to me, and surprisingly, it revealed a note I assumed had been hidden under it. The note was stained with what looked like hot sauce, but as I looked closer, the room fell silent as we all realized what had really stained the note. We looked around for Mr. Anderson, but we seemed to be the only ones in the room. Nico slowly collected the note and read its contents aloud.
Evening, lovely guests, and welcome to my playground. Within these walls you will partake in a truly revolutionary game of survival, where the strength of your humanity shall be tested. Only one among you shall leave. For the rest must embrace the role of the condemned. To emerge from this abyss, you must confront the darkest facets of your humanity and reckon with the haunting truth that life is fragile, easily extinguished by the specter of death. If you decide not to participate in my game, none of you shall leave, and I will be forced to believe that none of you have the right to live. To he or she who shall prevail and prove humanity's darkness, you have until sunrise to rid of your compatriots.
The words silenced the room and left a feeling of dread hanging above us. None of us were murderers, but whatever twisted game this was demanded we became killers. I could see panic on the faces of everyone in the room as we looked around, suspicious of everyone else. Vanessa, the oldest of the group and the head of the debate team, then said,
"This is ridiculous and an extremely stupid prank to play on people. We've all had dinner now. Let's all go to bed."
Everyone got up slowly and headed to their rooms. Jesse held my hand to stop me.
This seems a bit too weird to be a prank.
I immediately decided he was right and responded with,
"Yeah, I agree. So what do we do?" "We should probably go get Mr. James and the driver," he said.
We walked upstairs to the room where they were staying and knocked, but there was no answer. We knocked again, but no answer. We knocked again for the third time, and this time, the door slowly creaked open. We walked in, and I almost threw up from the disturbing scene of our supervisor, Mr. James, and the driver lying in bed, tied up, with their throats slit open, and eye sockets empty. We quickly ran out of the room horrified, but as we turned to leave, we saw Vanessa headed our way from down the hall, saying something. I couldn't make out exactly what she was saying, but before she could get any closer, a door beside her swung wide open, and Jessica, another member of the debate team, quickly stabbed her in the chest several times. Vanessa fell to the floor immediately, and Jessica, who was now standing above her lifeless body, stood for a while before dropping the knife and trembling as she processed what she had just done. She turned to us and ran, as she probably assumed we would do to her what she had just done to Vanessa. "What the fuck is going on, man?" I said before resting my head in my hands, panicking. Jesse was also panicking at the time, but we couldn't afford to stay in the corridor as a piercing scream filled the hotel. Jesse got out his phone, but there was no service, and all the exits had been closed off.
"Hey, Jake, look at me. We have to stay calm. We need to move and get to our rooms and hide until this is all over," he said.
I pulled myself together, and we quickly ran to our room before proceeding to lock the door and move the bed behind it. We sat there for a while, and occasionally we would hear loud screams and noises come from behind the door until eventually everything went radio silent. Jesse had spent all the time looking out the window. It was barred, so there was no way to escape from it, and absolutely no one had come close to the hotel this whole time. The silence began to bother me again, and I began to feel with no one left in the hotel, the killer would find us and finish us off for not playing his sick game.
"Jesse," I said the first time.
Jesse stayed focused, looking out the window. I could tell he was desperately praying for someone to walk by.
"Jesse, we can't stay in here forever. There was nothing close to this hotel. We just have to find another way out of here," I said.
Jesse looked at me,
and I could tell no matter how hard he tried to stay calm, he knew we'd been cornered. We moved the bed slowly, and I held my breath as we prepared to open the door. My heart raced as I turned the knob. I slowly creaked open the door, and standing behind it was Nico with a bloody knife clenched firmly in his hand. He was wounded and had blood all over him. His eyes looked completely empty, and he let out a sigh of relief, as though he was thankful we had finally opened the door.
I'm sorry, guys, but they're all dead. I'm sorry, but I can't let you go. I need to leave. I need to leave now,
he said as he approached us slowly. We began to walk away from Nico slowly, but before he could reach us, an arm was quickly placed on him, holding him in place before slitting his throat open. The room was filled with the sound of a grotesque gurgle as Nico collapsed. Life extinguished in an instant. Mr. Andrews was standing behind him with a large knife in his hand. The sick grin on his face sent chills down my spine. He laughed before finally saying,
"Oh, don't be so shocked, boys. He wouldn't have made it far without those wounds. Besides, your friend has proven one of my points. In order to survive, humanity will reach the darkest parts of themselves and awaken the demons that they think they don't have. But there's something your friend Nico couldn't answer for me. You see, I've been watching, and the bond you two have is something special."
He paused to look at us both in the eyes before throwing 2 blades in the front of our feet and saying,
"Nico didn't care about most of you. But would one of you be able to kill the friend you consider a brother? Make the choice, or you both die."
Jesse immediately replied with, "Then I guess we die, 'cause neither of us are killers." At that point, my mind had begun racing. I couldn't kill Jesse. I would never. But what about all those things I hadn't done yet in my life? I wanted kids and a wife. I wanted to be a lawyer. I hadn't even seen anything I'd wanted to see in the world. Tears began to fill my eyes as I bent over and picked up the knife. At that moment, Mr. Anderson and I made eye contact. He then looked at Jesse and with a wicked smile said,
"Are you sure about that?"
I immediately turned and stabbed Jesse in the stomach. His eyes were immediately filled with sadness, and soon after, tears. In that moment, regret instantly filled me, and I began to choke out apologies. My voice trembled as he bled out and fell to the floor.
"I'm sorry, man. I'm so sorry."
Mr. Anderson's maniacal laughter quickly filled the room as he began laughing hysterically. In a few seconds, Jesse's coughs were soon drowned in blood, and after a while, he was dead.
"Well, that was fun. Congratulations, Jake. You can now leave. But I'd hurry if I were you."
Mr. Anderson stopped talking, and I could hear sirens in the distance. I quickly ran to the window and could see police lights in the distance. Confused, I turned to Mr. Anderson and said,
"What did you—"
Before I could complete my sentence, Mr. Anderson thrust his knife into his stomach and fell to the floor laughing. My heart sank as the horrifying truth dawned on me. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity before I quickly hurried down the stairs, burst through the door, and disappeared into the night. I've been on the run for 3 years now, and I have no place to live and no reason to live. Every passing day, my guilt worsens for what I did to Jesse, and I feel it's time to atone for my sins. Mr. Anderson was on TV a few weeks after the incident, and he lied blatantly about the events that took place that night. This letter details the events of the hotel massacre, and Mr. Anderson should be charged accordingly with several counts of murder. If this letter is being read, then I have now turned myself into the authorities and will likely face numerous charges without this letter ever being considered as evidence. But advice to the readers: beware of what hotels you sleep in, as they might be the very last place you ever sleep in.
It all started when I woke up to the sound of someone hammering on my apartment door. That was the first fright I got that night, heart pounding my chest as I grabbed the bat I kept under my bed and headed towards the door. First thing I do is look through the peephole to make sure it's not anyone sketchy, but I'm greeted by the sight of one of my neighbors. She looks terrified. She's covered in blood, and I can see just through the peephole that her face is a mess. I open up the door, she runs inside and immediately says, "You gotta get me out of here. My boyfriend's trying to kill me." I start to ask her what happened, and she says something like, There's no time. Just please get me out of here. I swear to God, he'll kill you too for just helping me. That was what sent me into a straight-up panic, because if a guy was willing to beat his girlfriend up that badly, Lord knows that he'd be willing to put me in the ground. I just grabbed my car keys, ran downstairs with the girl following close behind, jumped into my car, then took off into the night. I remember asking her if she had anywhere I could take her, like a friend's or a relative's or something. She said no, and the best thing for us to do would be to drive to a motel so she could call the cops from there. So that's exactly what I did. I drove us to a motel and booked us a room. The clerk was obviously just as concerned as I was, but all it took was to explain that her boyfriend had tried to off her, and they were like, "Geez, make sure you guys call the cops at least." The girl, whose name I didn't know at that point, I just knew she was a neighbor, said that she'd go up to the room and call them, then asked me to get her some ice from the ice machine so she could deal with the swelling on her face. When I got to the room, she said the cops would be there ASAP, took the ice, put it on her face, then just burst into tears. I tried my best to reassure her, telling her she was safe and stuff. Then, when she finally calmed down, I asked her what actually happened back at her apartment. She told me her boyfriend was abusive, and that she'd been planning on leaving for a while, but that night was the night she'd finally got the courage together to announce it to him. She said he walked into their bedroom to find her packing a bag, and not long after that, everything went to chaos. She started helping herself to the little bottle of liquor from the minibar, but not after promising she'd pay me back for them once everything had blown over. I had no reason to disbelieve her at the time. I mean, I felt like we had a kind of bond established already, but I abstained because I thought I'd be driving back to the apartment pretty soon. I asked her if she was good to wait on her own while the cops drove out to her, but she asked me if I'd stay to keep her safe. She then made the point that if her boyfriend found the blood on my apartment door, she assured me that she'd left some on there while hammering on it, that he'd know she'd been there and he'd try to attack me, or worse. I'll be honest, I thought it was a pretty good point at the time. I hadn't seen the blood myself, but she was so covered in it that I believed her when she said that there was some on my door. Anyway, about an hour goes by and the cops still haven't showed up, and the motel rooms were arranged in a horseshoe shape, so we'd have seen them rolling into the parking lot if they had. I asked her to call them back to see what was going on, because obviously it was a really urgent situation, and I know that there was basically no way for the boyfriend in finding us, but I was still really paranoid that he would somehow. That's when the inconsistency started, because she gave me some lame duck of a reply like, "I'm sure they'll be here soon." If that was me, I'd have called 911 again if they hadn't shown up within like 10 minutes. So what was she so calm about that she was just cool with waiting for them for like an hour at that point? I put it down to booze, and at that point I was okay with waiting too. It wasn't like I had anywhere to be. I sure couldn't just go back to my apartment with that psycho supposedly just a few doors down. But that's also about the same time that I started checking out the amount of blood on her nightshirt. She had like an oversized t-shirt and girl boxers on, and like I said earlier, they were drenched with blood, but also with some blood splattered too, like little spots here and there. She had this cut over her eye, and she had a nasty busted lip, but it looked like way too much blood for just those small wounds. So I asked her if she had any other kind of injuries, like an abdominal wound of some kind that might account for all the blood on her. She said no, and that it was all from the busted lip in her eye. And immediately I start smelling nonsense. I asked her again what exactly had happened back at the apartment, and she started getting weirdly defensive about what she told me. I was starting to think it wasn't quite the abusive spouse kind of story that she told me the first time around, but I had no inkling of what was really going on. That being said, I was getting tired of waiting for the cops to show, so I decided to call them back myself. All I had on me was my wallet, my phone, and my car keys, the only three things I'd had time to stuff into the pockets of my shorts before fleeing the apartment. But when I take my phone out to call the cops, she says something along the lines of, "What are you doing?" I state the obvious, I'm about to call the cops back, and she's like, "Don't." I don't know if it was the way she was looking at me, the way she spoke, or the way she sort of tensed up when I told her that I was about to do that, but the mood in the room just shifted completely, I asked her why not, and just went right back to dialing 911. But by the time the operator spoke down the line, I looked up and saw she had a knife in her hand. She just said, "Hang up, now."
911, what's your emergency?
So I did. I never had a knife pulled on me at that point, and I can't overstate how terrifying it was. It wasn't even just the knife either. It was the overwhelming creepy sensation of knowing that all wasn't what it seemed. I wasn't hiding from the threat. I was with the threat. I'll be honest here. I basically begged her not to hurt me, and to my relief, she said she wouldn't as long as I drove her to the Canadian border. Given this was in Detroit, the border isn't all that far, but I didn't want to catch charges for aiding and abetting or whatever, so I knew I had to think of something to stop that from happening. It's not like I knew I couldn't tell the cops that I'd been threatened or whatever, but I also knew that the longer I spent in this girl's company, the more chances I'd have of being stabbed. So, I tell the girl that I'd drive her to the border, but that I needed to get something to eat first. I play it like I wanted to stop somewhere on the way, knowing she'd reason me down to getting something delivered from a 24-hour joint. She also stated that she'd be the one going down to pick the food up, as she didn't want me having the chance to sound the alarm. That's where she messed up, because she didn't seem to realize, to my infinite relief, that I could order from DoorDash and put something in the notes about needing the cops called to the motel. My whole plan hinged on there being a driver around that late at night, but thank God there was, and I was even able to show her the order without bringing up the notes section that mentioned needing 911 called to the motel. And the cops played it perfectly too. They showed up without any lights and sirens on, didn't park in the lot, walked up to the motel room without being spotted from the window, and just knocked on the door like they were a delivery driver. She walks over, opens up the door, then boom, they had a gun and a taser drawn on her before she even knew what was happening. She had the knife tucked into the back of her girl boxers, but the cops were wise to her drawing on them, and she hit the floor hard after they hit her with the taser. Turned out they'd been looking for her because, get this, she was the abusive partner who'd stabbed her boyfriend almost to death before finding some poor schmuck, i.e. me, to drive her to the border. Dude almost bled to death in their apartment but managed to crawl to another neighbor's place to get help. You should have seen the amount of blood in the hallway when I got back to my apartment building, and the whole place was crawling with cops and forensic gear. I thought I might be able to drive over to a friend's place to stay the night, contaminating a crime scene or whatever, but they had this section of the corridor closed off so I could actually get into where I lived. The cops came to my apartment in the morning to take my statement down and to fill me in on what they thought had happened. That's how I found out exactly what the deal was. It was 100% the craziest, most frightening thing that's ever happened to me, ever in my life, and just the fact that I was part of it seems completely surreal to me. But the thing that sticks with me is how easily I swallowed her nonsense story at first, how I thought it was helping someone I knew, someone I could trust, when in reality, one wrong move, and I might not actually be around to tell you this.